Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Stone Age Gamer. Today's episode is called King of the Ring, Capcom vs. Konami. Enjoy.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Stone Age Gamer podcast. This is episode 4, and tonight we will be having a very, very heated discussion about certain wonderful topics. I'm your host, Chris Pogo Kane Randazzo, and with me tonight is Dean Megabuster DeFalco.
Woohoo!
Dan Pack of Cigarettes Ryan.
I quit smoking, sir.
And Mike Vampire Killer Sheridan.
What's going on?
As you may have guessed by the nicknames I've given everybody tonight, tonight's topic, as aforementioned in the intro, is Capcom versus Konami. These are two of the most seminal third-party publishers in the history of video games. They've been around for eons and eons, and we're going to try to come up with a conclusive decision of which game company is the superior product producer. So, any questions before we dive in?
Can I be Mega Man for the entire podcast?
Yes, Dean. Yes, you can.
Oh, so good.
All right, if I'm going to be Snake, right, a pack of cigarettes, which I do appreciate, can I not be Old Snake? Because the mullet and mustache combo is not a thing that I am all about. One or the other would have been fine, the mustache or the mullet, but both, that is treacherous ground.
Well, gentlemen, let's dive right in. Let's start off with a brief description of our competitors. Tonight we have Capcom, which is an amalgamation of Capsule Computers, which is what they used to consider arcade machines, or at least the companies Capcom used to refer to them as. They were established in 1983. They started as an electronic gaming company, and they are known for properties such as Mega Man, Street Fighter, Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, and a whole lot more. On the other hand, we have Konami, whose name is a mishmash of three of the founders' names. They were established in 1973, a full 10 years earlier than Capcom. Didn't actually start producing games for another few years after that. Mostly they established in order to create amusement machines for arcades. And they're known for properties such as Castlevania, Metal Gear, Contra, and even Yu-Gi-Oh! Woo. Both of these companies have a rich history of original IPs and licensed properties, and have seen a lot of radical changes, reinventions, and wacky stuff over the years. So, this is a difficult subject to broach because there's so many different ways to attack this. You can pit contemporaries against one another, but both companies' game libraries have been so broad and so diverse that I feel like the only fair way to do this is to kind of break it down by era and see who comes out on top. So, we're going to start with the Golden Age. When we refer to the Golden Age of gaming, we're talking about Atari, arcades, pre-NES stuff. How do we all feel about the kinds of games that these companies were making way back when?
I barely remember them, unfortunately. Frogger was awesome. That's one that always sits highly in my head, and that's as far back as you can go. Frogger's been around for forever.
Yeah, Frogger is an old school arcade machine, and that was one of Konami's first breakout hits.
Well, and if we're talking about contemporaries as far as back in the Golden Age, I know we had spoken briefly during the week. Konami's got Frogger, obviously, is huge. What contemporary does Capcom really have for that? And I think the argument we're somewhat in agreement would be the 1942-1943 game. Those are still an absolute blast to play.
They are fantastic, but the mechanics are incredibly different. Frogger's a super basic game. In 1943, while the idea is very clear-cut of just shooting and everything, the enemies, the power-ups, even the sprites. I mean, everything was so detailed in that game. It was mind-blowing. I mean, off the top of your guys' head, do we have dates on either of those?
We can certainly find them because the internet is at our command.
Right, so while you guys are looking at that, I mean...
Discussing kind of to the point that you were going for there, and while it is an interesting thing to think about, comparing Frogger to 1943, I think where it really falls apart is that Frogger it's more of an obstacle course, whereas 1943 is very much a shooter.
Yeah, I feel that's a really tough comparison.
Yeah, I would somewhat make the arguments, though, that the shmups or the shoot-em-ups are obstacle courses, though.
I think I can agree with that.
The patterns are set the enemies come in the same every single time, and if you've seen somebody who is really, really good at 1942, 1943, there is a level of just involvement in that title because you've memorized that pattern. Very similar, I think, to Frogger. Now, obviously, there are huge differences between the titles, but I do think as far as that era of gaming, there is a decent argument to be made.
I think where the real intrinsic difference comes from is that in 1942, you're moving your thing and you're trying to dodge things, but the screen auto-scrolls. So your purpose isn't necessarily to get from point A to point B. You're not navigating from point A to point B. Your ship is getting from point A to point B and you survive. Whereas Frogger, you have to get your avatar from point A to point B, which is, I think, where the real disconnect comes from those. I mean, if you were going to compare 1942 and 1943 to a contemporary in the Konami debate, I would probably put it in maybe the what are they called? Stinger. Stinger was an Americanized version of Twin Bee, but they were top-down shooters. They were considerably more goofy. They were very lighthearted, similar. They actually kind of sort of played into a different Konami franchise called Parodius, which was a parody of shooters, which is a really weird game. Never really came out in America until the Wii Virtual Console, but I think those are more contemporaries than that. To get back to the dates, Frogger came out in 1981, 1942 came out in 1984.
Yeah, there's a 3-year difference there. And
I mean, the big progression.
Yeah, technology makes huge leaps, even every couple months, even back then. So
yeah, even back then.
So to see graphics like Frogger and then 1943 or 1942 rather, is a big, big leap. And the other thing is, just to build on top of what Chris was saying, is the fact that Frogger, the background's static, never moves or anything. In 1943, the background's always moving, and it's a little bit different, I guess, to what Frogger was.
That being said, Frogger, I feel, has stood the test of time a little bit more than 1942, 1943. Because you don't really see that series show up too much anymore. They've had a handful of Japanese versions of it, like 1940X and things like that. But Frogger has evolved over time. They've actually taken that property and turned it into several different things. I'm thinking specifically to the PlayStation release of Frogger, which took that exact same formula and added a handful of different stages to it. And I look back on that as one of my favorite games of that era because, number one, it wasn't that ugly, because most games of that era are freaking hideous. But there are some basic things that you can do with a game where you're moving a character. And I think the evolution of what they did with that property is more interesting than what Capcom ever did with the 1940s series.
I agree.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and mostly because Frogger became a character, certainly not a mascot character, but nobody really gets excited to see the plane from the 1940 series. But you see Frogger, and you're like, oh, it's Frogger. Yeah, I love Frogger.
He jumps across the street.
Yeah, nobody's like, oh, that's a sweet plane. Well, look at that. It's got engines and wings, and I'm all about it, right?
Well, personally,
Frogger's more known.
Yeah, Frogger is more known. Mike's got a great point that Frogger is definitely more well known. I believe Frogger was a much more successful arcade game back in the day, because even though 1942 was popular enough to get sequels, Frogger didn't necessarily need too many sequels. I mean, there was a Frogger 2 3-Deep on Atari 2600 and that kind of stuff. For the most part, when you look at the arcade scene, Frogger was a stalwart all the way through the 90s, and the 1940s games eventually wound up getting replaced by other things. So
there's no 1942 episode of Seinfeld.
Exactly. The first part of this argument I'm going to feel is leaning towards Konami, but there are two more important arcade games of the more or less pre-NES era that I want to touch on before we move forward to the next era of gaming, and that is Capcom's Commando and Konami's Contra.
Ooh, that's it. Well, I mean, I'm just gonna go right off the bat and say Contra has a very special, happy place in my heart. So I'm already gonna say Contra.
Well, Contra definitely has an important place in all of our hearts, I think, but not the arcade version of Contra.
Right. I would argue that most people might not even realize that there was an arcade version of Contra.
Yeah, and I know it certainly pissed off a lot of people when they released Contra on Xbox Live Arcade, and it was not the NES version, it was the arcade version. And you play that game, and if you're used to the NES version and any of its sequels, afterwards there's something very slow and clunky about it. Now, even though it was fairly revolutionary at the time, with the two-player cooperative, you still had stuff like the spread gun, and the same basic mechanics and the music were all there, but there's something about the arcade version of Contra that it's just off. It just never quite.
It doesn't feel right
to me.
Right, but I don't know. There's just something about Commando that I like the idea. You know, I'm a big fan of top-down shooters, but there just seems to be a myriad of them at that time, and Commando just seems like one of those games that fell into that genre for me and never really came out of that muck.
Well, see, my first experience of Commando was playing it on the Atari 2600, which is another thing that we have to take into consideration when we're discussing this era, is the ports to the home consoles at the time. And obviously stuff like Contra and 1942 weren't ported to the Atari at the time, and I think Contra was a little late for that. Contra might be pushing it in the whole which era that it falls into, but it is a pretty decent contemporary to Commando. But Commando had a very impressive port on the Atari, considering how, I guess, involved the game is for the primitive hardware of the Atari 2600. Mike, Dan, do you guys have any feelings on Commando?
I don't have any on the Atari 2600 version. There is an NES version, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay, that is the one that I have played.
Me as well.
Yeah, I never owned a 2600, so I'm out as far as that is a decent version or not.
My only history was on the NES. That was it, but I still preferred Contra Arcade to it.
Well, all right then. I believe first round is going to have to go to Konami. Is everybody in agreement?
Agreed.
Very
Absolutely.
happy about it.
All right. Time to move on. This is the NES/Sega Master System era, the 8-bit era of gaming. This is where most of us got introduced to these characters and franchises that we know and love. And this is also where most of their primary franchises came from. This is where we got Mega Man from. This is where we got Castlevania from. There's so much to talk about here in the 8-bit era. So we're going to be talking about NES and Master System games from these companies.
All right. I'll start this off. I mean, I think probably two of the biggest ones would be Mega Man versus Castlevania. That's two titans of that time going head-to-head against each other. And they're both fantastic games. They both had sequels that were great. But I'd probably have to hand this one over to Capcom because Mega Man had such strong sequels. It only got better with time. Castlevania was good, and Castlevania 2 was okay. It wasn't better. There were definitely some parts that definitely got worse at that point, and the whole idea of the game with the night and day sequences made it very, very trying to get through. Mega Man was tight. It felt good. I can't say the same for Castlevania. The first one was great. The second one was okay. The third one, no one seems to even bring up. So that's just where I'm at. You know, Capcom and Mega Man, that's just one of the many that I could go on about right now.
Well, the thing with Mega Man, it progressed. It just evolved. Castlevania took a chance on Simon's Quest. They changed the format of it. They brought a little more RPG to it. And I love Castlevania 3. The whole switching characters, amazing. Multiple paths, amazing.
I'm with you,
Yeah,
Mike. I love Castlevania 2 and I love Castlevania 3. However, I do think I lean, at least in this era of gaming, more towards Mega Man as being perhaps the strongest showing from any company during the 8-bit era of gaming. I mean, I would make that argument that Mega Man is the best that 8-bit got.
He's the blue fucking bomber, of course.
It's true, but I mean we're also talking about 6 NES games as opposed to 3. You know, so
Yeah.
You've got 6 Mega Man games, 3 Castlevania games, and here's the thing: Mega Man was definitely on it had a distinct pattern to it, and the games, while they refined with each different iteration, what Mike is saying is absolutely correct. That Castlevania was definitely more daring. Now, the original idea of Mega Man was incredibly daring, where you would get to choose which order you played the levels in. And whereas Castlevania went from a straight, level by level platformer action game into an open world exploration, almost Metroid type game, then taking elements of that, the first two games, combining them together with the branching paths and the being able to choose different characters, those kinds of elements, and then brought them together into a third one, which was also extraordinarily technically impressive, which is something that the Mega Man games didn't really hit until, I would say, as far as like real pushing the hardware, with the exception of some very large and colorful sprites like the dog in Mega Man 2, the cats in Mega Man 3, the hippos in Mega Man 4. Those large, colorful sprites were very impressive, but as far as turning gears and sound fidelity, even though and this is such a hard thing to choose between, I would have to give the sound composition the slight nod to the Mega Man series over the Castlevania series. But, I mean, that's like comparing bacon-covered bacon and bacon-covered sausage, Those are just, they're so good, but there are certain quintessential things about the Mega Man franchise from a sound design point that I would have to give it the nod to. But as far as sheer ballsiness, Castlevania definitely gets the nod, because, I mean, I honestly can't remember if there was any instances of parallax scrolling in Castlevania, but I know the first time Mega Man 6 was one of the last NES games ever made.
Yeah.
And that actually featured parallax scrolling in Tomahawk Man stage, which was a fairly impressive feat. Very few NES games even attempted stuff like that, with the exception of probably the best example of it would be the ending of Kirby's Adventure, where you fight the Nightmare, which is one of the most visually stunning things the NES has ever produced. But I remember going through things like Castlevania, and because of its art direction, it was designed to be more detailed than Mega Man, which always had a more cartoony look to it. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for being able to pull that off with that limited of a palette that Castlevania went with. Man, that's a tough one.
I think maybe the one easy answer here, as far as the 8-bit is concerned, is that when you look at the sports games during that time period, Konami kills them. It's not even close.
Yeah, if we get
Blades
past
of Steel and Double Dribble, not to mention
Double
track
dribble.
and field.
Yeah, talk about technically pushing the envelope. Holy crap, Konami really, really, really ran with the ball on that one. I mean, Double Dribble, Blades of Steel had voice acting. You just mentioned track and field, which were also arcade games. Now, it's also interesting to look at that from an arcade game perspective, because Castlevania came from Haunted Mansion, right? Haunted Mansion, that was it called, Mike?
Haunted Castle, I believe.
Haunted Castle, and that was a more or less port of Haunted Castle.
Yeah.
Whereas Mega Man was a console game going forward, and this was during that time where when NES was still around, it was still that time when arcade games were these important things that you strove to, that you tried to emulate the arcade experience, but you could never create it perfectly because of how much more powerful these capsule computers were. But you got these great ports from Konami of games like Track and Field, Double Dribble, and Blades of Steel, where these were these arcade games that they shrunk down and made into very impressive NES ports.
I bring that up because I would make the argument that Blades of Steel is still the most fun hockey game that you can play. That game's still awesome.
I would agree with that.
It's between that and ice hockey for me.
Yeah, I mean, they're just fantastic. And I love the NHL games. Don't get me wrong. As NHL 93 on the Genesis, I played the hell out of that game. But Blades of Steel, man, that's where it's at. That is still just a great game.
Don't you get to play Life Force during the game?
Yes, during the intermission, in between periods, you get to play a little shooter, which was so cool.
Yep, advertising in their own game.
Yeah, that was great. Blam, Jackal. Love that stuff. But while there was all of that, the other thing that you've really got to pay attention to with Capcom was this era was their golden age of licensed titles, specifically their Disney license, because you've got DuckTales, DuckTales 2, Darkwing Duck, Rescue Rangers 1 and 2, Adventures in the Magic Kingdom, Tailspin, even Little Mermaid. These
Little
are all
Mermaid was awesome.
Great. great games with the Disney license, all with really great music and even other wacky, bizarre license stuff like Yo Noid. I mean,
agreed.
There's no reason for a Noid game to be any good,
right?
Well,
but
on the opposites, go ahead.
You're forgetting about a little knight named Arthur.
Oh, well, that's also true. You've got the Ghouls and Ghosts game that was on NES, which, while I will definitely concede that Ghouls and Ghosts is an important game, or sorry, Ghosts and Goblins, I don't feel like that series hit its stride until the 16-bit era with Super Ghouls and Ghosts and Ghosts and Goblins on Genesis. So, I mean, I honestly count the NES version of Ghosts and Goblins as a point against them in this era.
Ow.
Nap.
But
it's definitely an interesting comparison to make because the licensed Konami stuff, I mean, I would jump directly to the Goonies game.
Yeah, Goonies.
That
Goonies
game
too.
Is so goddamn good.
And ahead of its time. It
is so much better than it has any right to be. There is no reason that game should be as awesome as it is. And I would put it up there against any of the Capcom licensed titles. However, Capcom certainly has the depth of catalog as far as licensed titles are concerned. That I don't even think you can make an argument against.
Yeah, I mean, Konami's got Tiny Toons.
That's true. Konami's got Tiny Toons. They've also got the Ninja Turtles license.
Yep.
Which they had two solid Ninja Turtles games. You had two very solid Tiny Toons games. I mean, granted, there was one crappy Ninja Turtle game, and then you had Goonies 2, which was released in America, but Goonies 1 was also released on the Famicom in Japan, and those are both really solid games. But do they stack up against just about as close to 8-bit platforming perfection as something like DuckTales, where you can't take away the music of DuckTales. You cannot take away that the Moon theme is probably the quintessential piece of 8-bit music.
Yeah.
Next to the Super Mario Brothers theme. And even though Tailspin was a little bit of a boring game, Rescue Rangers, with its two-player co-op mechanics of picking up each other, and Darkwing Duck, that was kind of like a Mega Man game, these were really, really high-caliber games and also extraordinarily memorable. Now, for all of the great things that Goonies did, Goonies was a pretty obtuse title.
Certainly.
That is not an easy game to figure out, and there are a lot of jagged edges as far as the game design of that is concerned. I mean, the platforming is not good. The jumping physics do not feel good. And for every great idea Goonies has, it kind of stumbles. Now, the closest contemporaries on these two would be the Tiny Toons games. You know, Tiny Toons 1 and 2 versus any of these, the Capcom platformers. I mean, if you just straight up compare Tiny Toons 1 and 2, I think DuckTales 1 and 2 takes both of them down without a contest, which really just leaves Konami with the Ninja Turtles license, which the first one is the definition of obtuse platformer, which is just straight up bad. And then you've got the second two, which are these really great side-scrolling beat-em-ups. And Capcom, with the exception of a very bizarre port of Final Fight called Mighty Final Fight on the NES, didn't really get into the beat-em-up territory on NES.
I'm with you on that. I think when you look at those, as much as I love those Goonies games, I do think Capcom takes the licensed titles pretty handily. I don't think you're going to see at E3 this year, I mean tomorrow at E3, I don't think Way Forward is going to come out and announce that they're remaking the Tiny Toons games. And if they did, I don't know that anybody would care.
I
care a lot.
Would you?
All right.
I mean, really?
Got to move on to the next. Got to move on to the next segment, which is going to be a short one. But before we do, for the NES era, roundtable, who wins? Dan.
Capcom.
Dean.
Capcom.
Mike.
Unfortunately, I have to say Capcom.
And I got to go with Capcom. So right now we're tied. Golden Age goes to Konami. NES era goes to Capcom.
But I feel like
Neither company really did much of anything on the Master System. Anybody listening, feel free to correct me on that, but I can't think of any off the top of my head of really good examples of games that either of them had on the Master System.
I think both of them really hit their stride on the Genesis.
I agree. But something that had both companies had a little bit going on both platforms, at least I think they did. The next era we're going to talk about very briefly is going to be the Game Boy Game Gear era.
All right, I'm just going to go with the one I know off the top of my head, and I'm sorry to drive it in again, but they call me the Mega Buster for a reason. What was it, Mega Man 1 through 4 on the Game Boy? Mega Man 1 through 5.
Mega Man games on the Game Boy, which is an impressive feat in its own right, considering they made 6 console Mega Man games and 5 Game Boy Mega Man games in that period of time.
And these games were good. I mean, they might have emulated the formula of what was going on the NES, but they were great games in their own right. You know, the graphics weren't exactly there, but the gameplay was. I really enjoyed them. I think I think it's number 4 was like the pinnacle of it all.
4 was really interesting because 4 started adding things like cutscenes, and it had the charge shot for Mega Man 4, but 4 pulled in things from Mega Man 4 and 5 and did things that the other games didn't do. Like there's this recoil to the a fully charged Mega Buster shot. There's cutscenes. There's the store, which originated in that game and eventually wound up showing up in later Mega Man games. And then Mega Man 5 was all original stuff. It had the Staroids, the Saturn, Venus, and all that, instead of traditional Robot Masters. And that's also where the Mega Man killers came from, which were some pretty cool original character designs.
Exactly. Super Game Boy for it.
Yeah, you could. They did have Super Game Boy support, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, back to the Mega Man versus Castlevania thing, you also had 3 Game Boy Castlevania games, which are varying quality. Both the Mega Man games and especially the first Castlevania, the Adventure for Game Boy, have this slow down thing that they moved so slowly. Especially Castlevania the Adventure is just
great soundtracks.
Yeah, great soundtrack, but it's pitifully slow. But then you look at the leap from Castlevania to Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, and wow, what a difference! Because Belmont's Revenge almost takes a page out of the Mega Man book, where you get to choose which stage you're going to go for right from the get-go, which is extraordinarily cool. Mm-hmm. And then the third Castlevania game for Game Boy, Castlevania Legends, also featuring Super Game Boy support, was the first Castlevania game to feature a female protagonist, and which was unfortunately wiped from the canon, but it was a pretty decent 2D Castlevania game at the time. It didn't do anything extraordinarily special besides having the female protagonist, but it was still a pretty nifty game.
Am I allowed to mention Kid Dracula?
You are, absolutely. I have very little experience with Kid Dracula. Talk to me about it.
I mean, it's just a fun platformer, You play as Alucard, but he's not the real Alucard. He's just all goofy. It was originally put on the Famicom, and from what I saw, it was a great platformer.
I have to hazard to agree.
Now, also in the Konami front, I don't think they really got involved in Game Gear much, but they did a lot of interesting ports of other stuff too. Whereas there was a good version of Bionic Commando on Game Boy, but it was vastly inferior to the NES Bionic Commando. Yeah. But Konami, on the other hand, made also a handful of really interesting Contra games on the Game Boy. They had Operation C and Contra the Alien Wars. I feel like there was a third one, and I'm just drawing a blank. But at the very least, Operation C, it was a brand new 2D Contra game. It introduced the homing shot, which was also reprised in my favorite Contra game, Contra 3 the Alien Wars. And it was really visually impressive for a Game Boy game because they managed to keep the frantic nature of a Contra game viewable and understandable on a Game Boy. And then when they ported Contra the Alien Wars down to the black and white Game Boy, which was astonishing just from a technical standpoint that it was even playable. And it was quite playable. And on top of that, you've also got the sports games, Double Dribble, Blades of Steel, and we actually forgot to mention during the NES period, Skate or Die. Yep. But now I'm coming up with Skate or Die is great. Now I'm coming up with all these great handheld ports, like the Game Boy ports for Konami. What is Capcom answering with in this department?
Mega Man.
I mean, you can even move it a step forward and incorporate Game Boy Color into this. And while color handheld stuff, Capcom never really jumped on a Game Boy Color version of Mega Man. But they did decide to make they licensed out to US Gold Mega Man and made a really crappy Mega Man game for Game Gear, which is ludicrously expensive, but it's also terrible. But when you move on if you incorporate the Game Boy Color, then you have to incorporate the phenomenal Metal Gear for Game Boy Color, or Metal Gear Solid for Game Boy Color,
right?
Which was just a technical masterpiece for that system. What a damn good game!
Well, and if you're talking Game Boy Color, correct me if I'm wrong here, this was not something that I was necessarily into, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Has Game Boy Color games, correct?
That is a very valid point, yeah. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was on Game Boy Color.
At that point, it's not, if you're talking about who wins and, based on popularity and sales, it's not even close.
Yeah.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a monster of a franchise.
And that continued in the Game Boy Advance era and whatnot, which we'll hit later. But all right, let's go around the room. It's time to move on. How do we feel? Game Boy Game Gear era. Dean.
Konami.
Dan.
Konami.
Mike.
Konami.
And I gotta go Konami too. Even defeating Mega Man, as much as I love those games, gotta give it to Konami. All right, Konami takes the lead. Next, this is going to be an interesting one. Super NES Genesis era. How do we feel about this?
Man, that's a tough one because you got Super Castlevania. Super Castlevania 4, Super Castlevania and Castlevania 4, correct? Or
Super Castlevania 4 are the same game.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's the name.
I didn't want to get anybody mad at me. No, it's a different game. But then you got Mega Man X on the other hand, which is, honest to God, my favorite freaking game of all time.
Damn.
Yeah, and then Konami on the other side had one of my favorite Sega games, which was Tiny Toons Buster's Hidden Treasure, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And as far as platformers go, I think that game was amazing and immensely underrated for what it was. Then you also have Super Contra as well during...
Contra 3, The Alien Wars. Super Contra was the NES sequel.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. And, it kept getting better and better. And, I think during this time there's so many games. And I'm going to throw it out while I'm talking. You guys can go ahead and discuss it. Fucking Street Fighter.
Oh, damn. Street Fighter.
I know. I'm throwing down the gauntlet now, man. Just things are getting real.
Now Street Fighter's getting in the mix. Before it was just Mega Man versus Castlevania. But now you're throwing Street Fighter.
Street Fighter's in the mix.
And if I might be mistaken, was Darkstalkers next gen?
Darkstalkers was next gen. Yeah,
okay.
That was
cool.
That was PlayStation era.
Okay, so I'll keep my mouth shut about that. But then one more platformer from that time. I guess I'll go through two more then. You got Sparkster, which was a.
I was going to bring that up.
I'm going to shut up then, and I'm not going to take any more.
Adventures for Genesis is, and that's really a solid point for Konami on this one, is introducing new franchises. Well, I guess they really. You got to look at how Konami embraced what these systems could do a little bit more than Capcom did at this point, because Capcom, all right, look at Mega Man X. Mega Man X is still visually stunning. The art direction in Mega Man X is so impeccable that you can still look at that game today and have a real hard time finding flaws in it. Whereas something like Super Castlevania 4 was just this technical powerhouse using, Mode 7 effects and everything to its fullest extent. But if you look at it now, it's because of its art direction, the Super Nintendo not really quite being able to handle it, even though gameplay-wise it is one of the finest games on the system, graphically it's a little bit ugly. But when you go later into the system's life and you look at something like Castlevania Dracula X, again, art direction takes over and reigns supreme and has some amazing visual effects, like the fire in the background of the first stage.
The soundtrack, too.
Oh, God, you're right, the soundtrack. Konami's mastery of the soundboard on the Super NES and the Genesis, which the Genesis soundboard was a difficult thing to master because a lot of Genesis music just sounds like...
beeps and boops.
And twingy and slap bass and whatnot. But when the Genesis finally got their hands when Konami finally got their hands on the Genesis and made stuff like Contra Hardcore and Castlevania Bloodlines and Rocket Knight Adventures and its sequel Sparkster, they really had a way of getting into the root of what made that system tick. And if you've never played those games before, you were missing out on some of the best looking Genesis games. But Capcom had...
Well, and if I can just jump in there with
ahead.
The best-looking Genesis games, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Manhattan projects...
Hyperstone Heist.
Hyperstone Heist, right. That game, in my opinion, is better than the Super Nintendo.
You are full of shit, sir.
I
out
am
of your
I am
damn
a
mind.
bigger fan. The sound is not nearly as crisp as it is in the Super Nintendo. I think it looks better on the Genesis.
I think you're out of your damn gourd. I think they're both good-looking games, but I mean that was a port. It was a damn conversion of Turtles in Time, and
I know that it was, but I like it better. I think it plays a little better. And I'm not a Genesis fanboy by any stretch of the imagination. I happen to like that game on Genesis better.
And this is why I hate you.
Well, sure, no, that's fair.
Yeah, but look, honestly, I think you're crazy. I mean, I got to respect your opinion on that one, but just thinking of the visuals between the two of those games, the Super Nintendo game is just so much sharper. But we have to move past that because we're now debating Konami versus Konami, and we're really got to get back to Capcom versus Konami. And really, I think the only proper contemporary to go against that on the Capcom side is Final Fight or Captain Commando. And Captain Commando or Final Fight. Final Fight was kind of impressive and unimpressive at the same time. It was very impressive because it had these huge sprites, these just gigantic sprites that looked almost exactly like their arcade counterparts. Same thing with Street Fighter. I mean, Street Fighter, the fact that they managed to port the game to Sega Genesis as well as they did, actually the fact that they were able to port that game to the TurboGrafx 16, which was also unbelievable that they were able to do that. That controller only had 2 buttons for crying out loud.
Right.
But they did it, and that really showcased some technical prowess on the Capcom side of things. And also, and I've never understood why this game gets as much flack as it does. Mega Man 7 is another one to take into consideration. I mean, Mega Man 7 was a very visually stunning game, and it had a lot going for it as far as trying to shake up the Mega Man design by incorporating a few things they did with the X series, which was also a big risk on their part because when Mega Man X came out, you had 6 NES games, 5 Game Boy games with the same basic premise, and then this is where the Mega Man series started to branch off and become something different. Which, if you look at the overall scheme of things, we were arguing about the Castlevania being more bold as opposed to Capcom doing the same thing. But eventually, I think the Mega Man brand became more versatile than the Castlevania brand because there's Mega Man RPGs, there's Mega Man Soccer.
That's a great game.
These things all exist in Castlevania, even though it eventually turned into this Metroidvania type thing, where that's where that phrase comes from when they did Symphony of the Night. Castlevania kind of stuck to its guns and stuck to what it did, and there was eventually a Castlevania fighting game, but it was a piece of garbage, whereas the Mega Man fighting games, Mega Man the Power Battles, and Mega Man's inclusion in stuff like Marvel vs. Capcom were pretty decent. So,
well, and going back to what you were saying, things like Final Fight and the side-scrolling beat-em-ups that Capcom put out, I really liked, and I haven't played this game in a very, very long time, but I was a big fan of Knights of the Round back in the day, which was a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but you had swords and shit. You were the Knights of the Round Table. It was awesome. Absolutely loved that game. And I don't know that many people actually even played that game.
I've only played it in emulation.
It
was awesome.
At all.
Yeah, it was one of the ones that I really liked. And this is a very hard era to debate here because, the Street Fighter 2, without a question, is just an absolute masterpiece. But Konami did some really great stuff there in the 16-bit time period. The Prince of Persia game back then was an awesome game. Sunset Riders was great. That was an awesome
Konami
game.
Publish Prince of Persia back then?
They did, and I think that's enough for them to get credit for it. And Gradius 3.
Gradius 3.
That game is out of control. Awesome.
That game may be out of control, but Capcom wins the side-scrolling shooter thing hands down with UN Squadron, which is the best side-scrolling shooter ever created.
Agreed.
And that's a damn licensed game, which sucks because that means it'll never get re-released on anything. But holy crap, UN Squadron.
That is pretty phenomenal.
Also, at this point in time, I'd like to mention that we're talking about games now like Mega Man, Street Fighter. There's a whole mess of them on Capcom where they're still easily relatable now, where I feel like there's less on Konami where you can say the same thing. Konami's more like, I remember those, or like, I played those one time. On Capcom's side, I feel like from this point forward, Konami starts falling off a little bit, and Capcom keeps putting out more, and Konami focuses on ones that worked for them.
But with Konami, they were killing it on both platforms. From everything we've been saying, Capcom is predominantly Super Nintendo.
Yeah, I mean, Wily Wars didn't even get a release in America, and they didn't even, make that game. They farmed it out.
Yeah.
While Wily Wars is extraordinarily interesting, it's basically Super Mario All-Stars for Mega Man. It's not really an original property. But I think what we're going to run into here is that Konami had more different types of games, whereas Capcom had more of the seminal games. I mean, the games that Capcom made during this era are, I think, a little bit more legendary, like Mega Man X and Street Fighter II, as opposed to some of the best iterations of the Castlevania games, Contra 3: The Alien Wars,
Turtles in Time. And also
Rocket Knight, Zombies Ate My Neighbors.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you've got Tournament Fighters as well.
Tournament Fighters is an interesting thing to bring up because it was basically cashing in on the whole Street Fighter craze, but they also made a version of that game for NES, which is remarkable. Yeah. And I hate to backstep a little bit, and I don't think this necessarily changes the outcome, but we glossed right over the Zelda games, the Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, which Capcom made for the Game Boy Color.
That's true.
Does that change our opinion of the Game Boy Game Gear?
No, because I'm still on. Well, no, I feel like as far as Konami went, they're still on that side. One extra title I don't think can make up for what Konami put out.
Yeah, I agree. I think it balances the scales a little bit more, but I think I'm going to still leave Konami on top of that one. But it was worth mentioning. It
closer. Yeah, it definitely makes it closer, but it's not Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah, it's a valid point. Those games did not sell the way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Sold.
No, they did not.
If you told me that was a property that would still be around today, I would not believe you. All right, this is
a surprise.
We got to start cutting this one. We got to start cutting this one down. So, Super NES Genesis era. Is there a winner, or is this a draw?
I'm on the side of Capcom. That's just me.
Dan?
As much as I love Street Fighter and Mega Man, I lean Konami on this one, mostly because for me personally, I played more Castlevania and Contra and Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Turtles in Time than I did Capcom titles at this point.
So that's one. Dean, you said Capcom?
Yes, I did.
That's one Capcom, one Konami. Mike?
I got to go with Konami on this. And Castlevania and both platforms. They just killed it on both.
Yeah, I would agree. That's the other thing, too. Capcom's Genesis output was shit.
Yep.
It was bad.
Yeah, that's a valid point.
That Street Fighter on Genesis is unplayable garbage.
Well, you get a 6-button controller, and especially by the time they made Super Street Fighter, really Super Street Fighter on Genesis, while vastly inferior to the Super NES version, it is at least still playable and respectable that they made it in the first place. And God, this is such a tough one for me. I'm so close to calling a draw because I loved Final Fight. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was really where that series hit its stride, and it's still soundtrack wise what they were able to get out of the Super NES sound card, even that close to launch, is just unbelievable. And Street Fighter, there are a few games outside of Nintendo published titles that I played more than Street Fighter at the time.
And there were another slew of Disney games on top of that were pretty good.
Aladdin and Goof Troop are the only ones I can think of.
I thought the Mickey had some games on there. I could be wrong.
Yeah, the Magical Quest.
He was also tossed around by other companies, I believe.
Oh, Magical Quest was by Capcom, but the Mickey Mania, which was extraordinarily cool, was not Capcom. But Capcom did make... See, I've always been a big X-Men fan. and Capcom made X-Men for Super NES, which was really great, as opposed to the X-Men game on Genesis, which wasn't made by Konami, which isn't really relevant to this conversation, but it was not good in my opinion.
Well, and if I may throw in an argument here, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the 16-bit time period, the Disney game that we are all fond of is going to be Castle of Illusion, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is not Capcom.
No, it is not.
Okay. So there you go. Plus Lethal Enforcers. Come on.
Lethal Enforcers.
Lethal Enforcers.
And Rocket Knight Rocket Knight Adventures being so high on my list. That is such a tough call, but I'm going to see if I go Capcom, that makes it a tie. And I don't know that I can choose between the two of them. I gotta give the lean to Capcom. Street Fighter's just too damn important. Street Fighter was such an important game, encompassing the arcades, home consoles, none of this other stuff. Tournament fighters, Mortal Kombat, half the crap that happened on the Neo Geo. None of that stuff would have happened without Street Fighter. And between Street Fighter, UN Squadron, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, I gotta give the nod to Capcom here, which means that we're tied on the Super NES and Genesis era. That's got to be a tie. So
Konami's still in the lead, though.
Konami's still in the lead. So now we move on to N64 and PS1 era.
But before we do, we're going to take ourselves a little break. Yes, with the magic of editing, we have cut this episode in half because this argument went on for considerably longer than we had originally intended. And it was very interesting. So make sure you check back with us next week as soon as we're done editing it and getting it all clean and pretty like. It'll be posted up in the regular spot. In the meantime, if you want to weigh in on this whole conversation, because it is a very interesting debate, I don't really seem to hear all that much. Send your questions to geeklifesite@gmail.com. That's G33KLifesite@gmail.com. Make sure you put Stone Age Gamer in the subject header, and that way we all know exactly what you're talking about. And any and all feedback we're more than interested in hearing. So that's going to be it for the night. Make sure you come back to geeklife.com for all of your geek lifing needs, and we'll see you in about a week.